The wind, a thin, cutting blade, keened against the reinforced walls of the radio observatory. I felt its vibrations deepen the concrete foundation, a constant, low thrumming that was as much a part of my existence here as the rhythmic pulse of the distant quasars I tracked. This place, perched on the highest, most desolate peak, was my sanctuary, my cage. For 2 decades, I, Arthur Chen, had dedicated myself to the unseen, to the vast, cold expanses between galaxies, the cosmic voids. Everyone else chased the light, the grand, fiery spectacles. I sought the silence, the profound absence, believing that within its depths lay the true architecture of the universe. It was supposed to be inert, a cosmic desert devoid of matter, energy, or interest. My models, meticulously crafted over years of solitary work, predicted nothing. My instruments, calibrated to exquisite precision, had always confirmed that profound emptiness. A soft, almost imperceptible blip registered on the secondary spectral analyzer. I blinked, my gaze snapping from the panoramic display to the smaller, dedicated screen. A single, anomalous peak, impossibly sharp, momentarily flared against the expected baseline noise. My initial thought was calibration drift, a rogue particle, or perhaps a minor atmospheric disturbance. This isolated perch, while ideal for minimizing terrestrial interference, was not entirely immune to the caprices of Earth's upper atmosphere. I leaned forward, my fingers dancing across the illuminated keys, cycling through diagnostic protocols. The hum of the cooling fans in the server racks intensified slightly, a mechanical sigh. My breath hitched, a faint mist in the cool, dry air of the control room. The anomaly persisted. Not a transient spike, but a sustained, albeit incredibly faint, signal. It was a phantom limb of data, a ghostly echo where there should have been only the predictable hiss of cosmic background radiation. My practiced hands moved with an economy born of countless hours spent coaxing secrets from the universe. I rerouted the primary feed, cross-referencing with the redundant array, isolating the band, filtering, amplifying. Each step was a ritual, a scientific prayer against the deceptive nature of false positives. The signal, however, stubbornly clung to its existence. A tremor, subtle yet undeniable, ran through me. This wasn't a familiar type of noise. It had a signature, a distinct harmonic profile that defied any known astrophysical phenomenon. It was too clean, too precise for cosmic rays, too stable for gravitational waves, too structured for the random scatter of interstellar dust. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and empirical deduction, began to feel a faint, disquieting tremor. I pulled up the raw data stream, stripping away the automated filters, seeking the signal's naked form. What emerged on the screen was not a simple sine wave, nor a chaotic burst. It was a sequence, a pattern of peaks and troughs that possessed a terrifying, impossible elegance. It wasn't repeating. There was no discernible cycle, no predictable periodicity. Each waveform, each rise and fall, was unique, yet intrinsically linked to the ones before it, building upon them with an almost deliberate intent. It was like reading a language I had never encountered, a script penned in the very fabric of spacetime. My heart began a slow, heavy thud against my ribs, a counterpoint to the distant keening of the wind. The air in the control room, usually a comfortingly sterile environment, now felt thin, charged with an invisible presence. And its voice was unlike anything I had ever conceived. Hours bled into each other. My eyes burned, but I could not look away from the scrolling data. The signal continued its impossible unfolding,
a tireless, non-repeating narrative from the heart of nothingness.
This wasn't a natural phenomenon.
This was a message.
And it was coming from a place that should not be able to communicate. A sudden, sharp headache lanced behind my eyes, a fleeting disorientation.
The numbers on the screen
seemed to shimmer, the lines of the spectral graphs subtly shifting, blurring at their edges. I rubbed my temples, forcing the sensation away. Just fatigue, I told myself, the consequence of prolonged focus. The signal, so meticulously observed, was beginning to feel less like an object of study and more like an active, insidious presence, reaching out across the impossible gulf.
It was a cosmic anomaly, yes, but it felt intimately, unsettlingly, personal. It was listening. And now, it was speaking directly to me. This place, perched on the desolate peak, was my sanctuary, my crucible. Now, it felt like a cage, its walls pressing in with the weight of an impossible discovery. My fingers, stained with the faint residue of lukewarm coffee, danced across the illuminated console. The signal, that impossible whisper from the void, sprawled across a dozen monitors, a tapestry woven from pure non-repeating chaos. Each data packet defied the elegant symmetries I had come to expect from the universe. It was a language without grammar, a melody without a scale, yet it possessed an undeniable, insidious structure. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the cool glass of the primary display. The patterns were not merely complex, they were alien to every principle of geometry I knew. A line would subtly curve, then intersect itself at an angle that, by all logic, should have been impossible. A sequence of points, when graphed, would form a shape that seemed to exist in 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional plane, its edges shifting and dissolving as I tried to trace them. My mind, a finely tuned instrument of logic, rebelled. It was like trying to fit a square peg into a constantly morphing, 5-sided hole. No, I murmured, the word a dry rustle in the quiet room. That can't be right. I reran the algorithm, then another, then a custom script I'd written years ago for analyzing gravitational lensing distortions. Each time, the results were the same, a profound, unsettling wrongness. My internal compass, honed by decades of cosmic navigation, spun wildly. It wasn't merely anomalous, it was fundamentally anti-Euclidean. My scientific training screamed error, artifact, malfunction. Yet, the equipment was pristine, calibrated to micro-arcsecond precision. The signal was real. A prickle of unease, cold and sharp, traced its way up my spine. I blamed the long hours, the relentless caffeine, the thin mountain air. My eyes felt gritty, burning. I rubbed them, then refocused on the screen. That's when it happened the first time. In my peripheral vision, the hard, rectilinear edge of the console desk seemed to waver. For a fleeting instant, the sharp corner softened, melting into a curve, then snapped back with a sudden, almost audible click that only I heard. I blinked, turning my head sharply. Nothing. The fluorescent lights hummed with their usual flat intensity. Just tired, I muttered, shaking my head. A phantom geometry, a trick of light and exhausted neurons. I pushed the thought aside, forcing my attention back to the data streams. The signal's complexity deepened as I burrowed into its lower frequencies. It was not merely a static pattern, but a dynamic, evolving construct. It seemed to breathe. And as it breathed, I began to perceive other subtle shifts. The shadow cast by the antenna tower, visible through the reinforced window,
seemed to lengthen disproportionately, stretching like taffy across the distant, snow-dusted ridges, before receding to its proper form. I glanced up, then back, a frown creasing my brow. The moon, a silver disk in the inky sky, seemed to shimmer with an unusual, almost iridescent quality for a moment, its familiar craters rippling like water. Then came the sound. I paused, tilting my head. The wind outside still keened, but this was different, internal. No reply, of course. Only the low thrum of the observatory, the gentle whir of cooling fans, and the distant, constant shriek of the wind. I listened intently, straining my ears. Nothing but the expected symphony of my isolated world. My imagination, I concluded, was finally beginning to fray at the edges. Too many sleepless nights spent wrestling with the universe's most enigmatic secrets. But the phantom geometries persisted. A flicker in the corner of my eye, the ceiling tiles briefly appearing to warp and buckle, then smooth themselves out. The framed photograph of my parents on a small shelf, their faces momentarily distorted, their smiles stretching into something grotesque, before settling back into their benign, sepia-toned expressions. Each time I turned, I stared, I found nothing amiss. Yet the memory of the distortion lingered, a faint afterimage burned onto my retina. They were not words, not even discernible sounds, but rather a sensation of unvoiced thought, a pressure in my inner ear, a soft, insistent presence that seemed to coalesce from the static of my own fatigue. I clenched my jaw, a fresh wave of determination coursing through me. This was the price of discovery, I told myself. The mind, unaccustomed to such profound revelations, would naturally try to resist, to rationalize the impossible away. I would not succumb. This signal, whatever it was, held answers. The static hum of the radio observatory had been my constant companion for decades, a familiar drone that once soothed the edges of my thoughts. My fingers, stained with lukewarm coffee and the residue of countless keyboard strokes, hovered over the console. The screens glowed with the impossible data, the non-repeating signal I had pulled from the void. It wasn't merely anomalous anymore, it was an affront to order, a defiant screech against the cosmic silence. A tremor ran through the floor, or perhaps it was just my weary legs. I blinked, rubbing the grit from my eyes. The metallic railing along the catwalk, usually a stark, unwavering line, seemed to undulate, its chrome surface rippling like water. But the image lingered, an afterimage burned onto my retinas. I leaned closer to the main display, a vast holographic projection of the signal's intricate patterns. They swirled, a kaleidoscope of abstract geometry and fractal complexity, each iteration more bewildering than the last. As I watched, a faint, dry rustle emerged from the speakers, a sound like autumn leaves skittering across barren asphalt, yet it seemed to emanate directly from the patterns themselves. It wasn't noise, it was structured. My breath hitched. I leaned in further, trying to discern words, a cadence, anything recognizable. The angles in the room began to shift. The sharp corner of the data rack to my left elongated, stretching into an acute point that shouldn't exist. I pressed my palms against my eyes, willing the distortions away, but when I opened them, the world around me still felt subtly wrong, as if the very geometry of the radio observatory was being subtly rewritten. My lab, my sanctuary, was becoming a funhouse mirror. Days bled into nights. The scent of ozone and stale coffee clung to me like a second skin. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, a weakness in the face of this unfolding enigma. My research wasn't just a pursuit, it was an all-consuming fire that devoured every waking thought, every spare moment. I ate at my console, the food tasting like ash, my gaze never straying from the screens. I flinched, turning to see a colleague, the lead technician, standing a few feet away, a mug clutched in his hand. His brow was furrowed, his eyes scanning my disheveled appearance. Just close to a breakthrough, I mumbled, my voice hoarse. I ran a hand through my already tangled hair. Closer than ever. Breakthrough or breakdown? The technician asked, his voice softer now, tinged with genuine worry. You haven't left the radio observatory in days. The assistant director is asking about your progress report. And you missed the team meeting. The report can wait, I snapped, turning back to the patterns. It's go home. Sleep. We can cover for you. No. The word erupted from me, sharp and desperate. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from a fierce, territorial protectiveness over my work. No, you don't understand. This isn't just data. It's a message. The technician paused, his expression shifting from concern to something approaching unease. A message? From what? The patterns, once a jumble of abstract shapes, began to resolve, to coalesce. They weren't random. They were deliberate. Each line, each arc, each impossible angle was a component of a larger structure. My mind raced, connecting the disparate elements, seeing the underlying logic. And then, it hit me. The patterns weren't merely an anomalous signal. They were too intricate, too specific, too designed. They weren't information about something, they were something. A language, yes, but more than that. An instruction set. A blueprint. A command. The technician cleared his throat, pulling me from the precipice of this terrifying insight. Arthur, you're not making sense. Are you feeling all right? I turned to him, my gaze perhaps too intense, my face undoubtedly pale. I've never been more lucid, I said, the words tasting like copper. This isn't just noise. It's a way to understand. A way to be. His eyes widened, and he took an involuntary step back. I had peeled back a layer of the cosmos, and beneath it, I found not empty space, but a profound, terrifying utterance. The laughter, dry and rustling like ancient parchment, had not faded with the dawn. It clung to the air within the radio observatory, a spectral static that no filter could erase. It was in the hum of the cooling systems, the whisper of the ventilation, the very tremor of the floor beneath my feet. A profound, terrifying utterance, indeed. I stood amidst the glowing array of monitors, my hands clenched, knuckles white. Fear, a sharp, metallic taste, pricked at my tongue, yet beneath it, a desperate, ravenous hunger for understanding began to gnaw. This wasn't a malfunction, not an error in calculation. This was a message, an address. The conventional avenues of astrophysics felt like flimsy paper boats against an incoming tide. Standard models, established theories, all seemed to crumble under the weight of this impossible signal. I needed to look elsewhere, somewhere the rigid frameworks of modern science dared not tread. My fingers, trembling slightly, flew across the keyboard. The main research terminal, usually a conduit for peer-reviewed journals and astronomical data, became a portal to the forgotten, the dismissed, the ridiculed. I started with the fringes of early 20th century cosmology, delving into archives of papers that had been consigned to academic purgatory. I found early discussions of etheric dimensions, theories positing the universe as a series of nested membranes, and wild speculations about non-Euclidean geometries influencing stellar drift. Was it the signal itself, permeating the very structure of the observatory, or merely the fragile scaffolding of my sanity beginning to buckle? I didn't know, and at that moment, I didn't care. The determination within me burned brighter than the fear. I discovered scanned copies of ancient philosophical texts, some translated from obscure languages, others from civilizations that had vanished into the dust of history. These weren't scientific treatises in any modern sense, but their descriptions of the cosmos struck a chord of terrifying familiarity. One such text, a collection of astronomical observations from a civilization predating recorded history, spoke of the Great Weave, where reality is but a single thread. It detailed how, in certain empty spaces between the burning lights, the weave thinned, revealing the true pattern beneath. The patterns described, though rendered in symbolic glyphs and abstract illustrations, bore an unsettling resemblance to the intricate, non-repeating sequences of my signal. It was a visual representation of the signal's architecture, rendered in ink on brittle, ancient paper. This was not a coincidence. This was an echo across millennia. I scrolled further, my eyes devouring the archaic script, feeling a sickening sense of recognition. They coalesced, forming distinct, guttural syllables, just beneath the threshold of comprehension. My vision blurred at the edges, the monitors seeming to pulse with a faint, internal light. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. I found myself tracing the ancient symbols on the screen with a trembling finger, a horrifying clarity settling upon me. These discredited theories, these forgotten texts, they weren't mere curiosities. They were warnings. They were fragments of a terrible truth, pieced together by minds that had glimpsed what I was now perceiving. They were vast, silent chambers, holding something ancient, something that had waited. And now, through my signal, through my obsessive deciphering, it was beginning to stir. It was beginning to manifest. My vision, already blurring at the periphery, intensified its distortion, the array of monitors across the console seeming to pulse not with light, but with a living, irregular beat. Each flicker of data became a jagged shard of perception, threatening to cleave my consciousness. No, this is fatigue, I rasped, the sound a dry, reedy thing in the cavernous silence of the radio observatory. My fingers, trembling with a tremor I refused to acknowledge as fear, flew across the keyboard, attempting to recalibrate the primary signal receiver. It had to be an environmental anomaly, a system overload, anything but what my deepest instincts screamed it was. But the equipment refused my commands. The data streams, usually a meticulous lattice of numbers and spectral graphs, writhed and coiled. The non-repeating signal, the very anomaly I had dedicated my life to mapping, no longer displayed as abstract patterns. Instead, it bled, a viscous, shimmering corruption, across the main screen. It was a liquid geometry, twisting upon itself, defying the flat plane of the display, suggesting depths and dimensions that should not exist. Then, the true breach. The air within the radio observatory, already thick with the unspoken presence of the signal, began to shimmer. It was a profound, systemic disruption, as if the very molecules of oxygen and nitrogen were rebelling against their known states. The familiar concrete walls, the sturdy metal framework of the console, the precise angles of the antenna controls, they all seemed to soften, to lose their rigid definition. My eyes, wide and unblinking, struggled to reconcile what they saw with what they knew. A tear, or perhaps a ripple, began to form not on a screen, but in the space directly before me, just beyond the primary monitor. It was an absence that was paradoxically vibrant, a swirling vortex of impossible colors that devoured light rather than reflected it. It was the negative space between stars made manifest, an expanse of nothingness that pulsed with a terrible, silent energy. And within this shimmering non-space, something began to stir. It had no shape, no form that my mind could grasp. It was a distortion, a ripple in the fabric of reality itself, yet I felt its presence with an unbearable clarity. It was less a thing to be seen and more a thing to be felt, an immense, ancient consciousness pressing against the thin membrane of my existence. This was real. We have been waiting. We are the spaces between. The words weren't spoken, they were implanted, etched directly onto the synaptic pathways of my brain. My vision snapped back to the shimmering tear in reality. The impossible colors deepened, drawing me in, threatening to unravel my very being. I could feel its pull, a gravitational force on my soul. But even as my sanity frayed, even as the world around me dissolved into an alien canvas, a desperate, defiant spark ignited within me. This was it. The ultimate discovery. I pulled my hand from the console, reaching for the small, rugged camera I kept for documenting anomalous equipment failures. My fingers fumbled with the power button, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had to record this. The veil had thinned. My vision, already blurring at the periphery, intensified its distortion, the array of monitors across the console rippling like disturbed water. The lines of data, the meticulously charted frequencies, no longer held their static form. They writhed, organic and vital, a dark current beneath the familiar script. I pressed my palms against my temples, the cool metal of the headset a stark contrast to the burning pressure building behind my eyes. "Arthur? Are you all right?" A voice, tinny and distant, broke through the growing cacophony. It was a colleague, standing a few feet away, their face a shifting mosaic of pixels in phantom light. I could feel the tremor in my hands, a fine, insistent vibration that matched the internal thrum. "It's clearer," I rasped, my own voice a stranger's dry croak. "The patterns. They're not just patterns. You're not making any sense. We're all worried about you." "Worried?" I laughed, a brittle, joyless sound. "You're worried because you can't hear it. You can't see the edges fraying. This isn't just astrophysics, it's an unveiling." The words tumbled out, urgent and unfiltered, each one a desperate attempt to convey the impossible truth that was now my sole reality. I tried to grab their arm, to pull them closer to the screen, to force them to see, but they recoiled, their eyes wide with unease. Days bled into a ceaseless cycle of frantic observation and a gnawing sense of isolation. My colleagues began to avoid me, their hushed conversations ceasing abruptly when I approached. The radio observatory, once a sanctuary of focused intellect, became a place of sidelong glances and hurried exits. The director, a man whose patience I had always taken for granted, summoned me to his sparse office. "Arthur," the director began, his voice devoid of its usual warmth, "your work has been
unconventional. Disruptive, even."
He tapped a stack of printouts on his desk, my recent reports, filled with increasingly abstract diagrams and fervent, almost theological prose.
"These aren't scientific observations. Manifestos. They are the truth."
I retorted, my hands clenching into fists. The very air in the room seemed to shimmer, the director's face momentarily replaced by a fleeting, indescribable geometry before snapping back into focus.
"The signal isn't just data.
It's a language, a living entity woven into the fabric of non-existence. It's showing me what lies between the stars, not just beyond them." The director sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of all my dwindling credibility.
"We cannot continue to fund a project that yields no verifiable results, only increasingly esoteric pronouncements. Your grant is being suspended."
They could take the equipment, the funding, the sterile objectivity. I gathered my few personal effects, a worn coffee mug, a dog-eared notebook filled with increasingly indecipherable scribbles, a framed photograph of a forgotten galaxy. Its structured reality was too small, too solid to contain the flowing truth I now held.
My apartment, once a sparse reflection of my ascetic habits, transformed into a chaotic den of obsession.
Old monitors, salvaged from forgotten projects, glowed with their own internal light, displaying my own code, my own interpretations. The air grew thick with the scent of stale coffee and unwashed clothes, a testament to the hours I spent hunched over the keyboard, chasing the fractal echoes of the signal. The world outside faded to a dull, unimportant hum.
Calls went unanswered, emails unread. The few lingering threads of my social life unraveled, each one snapping with the brittle finality of an abandoned thought.
My only companion was the encroaching madness, which no longer felt like an affliction, but a guide. It was during one of these endless nights, the city lights a distant, shimmering haze beyond my window, that the true nature of the signal's invasion revealed itself. I had been attempting to cross-reference my most recent, intensely personal observations with older, scientifically accepted astronomical data. The screen glowed with a familiar star chart, a constellation I had studied countless times. But as I focused, the lines of connection, the very stars themselves, began to subtly rearrange. A star, once a fixed point of light, pulsed with an internal, violet glow it had never possessed. It wasn't just showing me new truths, it was overwriting the old ones, replacing the mundane reality I once knew with its own, impossible framework. The celestial maps I had once memorized, the data I had painstakingly catalogued, were no longer reliable. They were fluid, malleable, bending to the will of the encroaching entity. The cold steel of the console bit into my palms, a familiar comfort in the vast, echoing chamber of the radio observatory. They had taken the main drives, the calibrated dishes, the very heart of my work. But they had left the peripheral systems humming, a skeletal framework of what once was. And crucially, they had left the whispers. They had left me. I had salvaged what I could, a makeshift array of sensors and a jury-rig receiver, tapping into residual energy, listening to the static between the stars. The signal, once a faint tremor, now thrummed beneath my skin, a second pulse beneath my own. It had become a language I felt more than heard, a geometry I perceived with a nascent, unfamiliar sense. The flickering indicator lights on my makeshift panel began to distort, their steady green and amber hues bleeding into an impossible spectrum. It wasn't my eyes, I'd checked them, rubbed them raw. It was the lights themselves, or rather, the space around the lights, that warped. The air shimmered, not with heat, but with an unseen pressure, a silent groan of reality under duress. A sudden, sharp crack resonated from the far end of the observatory hall, a sound like stressed metal. My head snapped up, my gaze sweeping past the silent, hulking forms of the decommissioned equipment. There, where the enormous, curved dish would have been visible through the reinforced glass panel, the very air seemed to thicken. It was a visual distortion, a ripple in the fabric of perception, but it carried weight, a crushing density that made my lungs ache. I pushed myself away from the console, my chair scraping harshly on the polished concrete. My footsteps echoed, too loud, too solitary. The shimmering intensified, coalescing into something that had no form yet felt profoundly present. My breath hitched. The geometry of the room began to subtly shift. The straight lines of the ceiling panels bowed inward, the corners of the walls seemed to recede into impossible angles. Then, a sound. It was the sound of something immense, something ancient, pressing against a barrier that was rapidly thinning. And with that sound, the distortion solidified. It wasn't a creature, not a being with limbs or eyes. It was a shape, but a shape defined by what it displaced, a colossal absence that nonetheless occupied space. It was a tear in the canvas of the real, and through that tear, something else was bleeding in. The edges of this perceived tear were not sharp, they were indistinct, wavering, like heat haze over a desert road, but infused with a malevolent, silent intent. A metallic groan tore through the observatory. Not from the air, but from the massive, inert support beams that held the building's dome aloft. I saw, with terrifying clarity, one of the thick girders buckle inward, slowly, silently, as if under an unbearable, unseen weight. Dust, fine and ancient, puffed from the stress fracture. My mind screamed that it was impossible, a hallucination born of exhaustion and isolation, but my eyes saw the bending steel, my ears heard the creak, and my body felt the tremor through the floor. It was not a trick of the light, nor a fever dream. It was not invading my mind, but blurring the lines between my mind and the world around me. The radio observatory, my sanctuary, was becoming an extension of its impossible geometry. I took another step back, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. This wasn't the abstract beauty I had pursued, the elegant patterns of an unknown intelligence. This was raw, unadulterated pressure. The shape, the absence, seemed to expand, its unseen mass pushing against the very air. My hand fumbled for the console, for the comforting, mundane reality of buttons and screens. I slammed my palm down on the emergency shutdown, a desperate, irrational act. The hum of the scavenged equipment died. But the distortion did not recede. The bowed lines of the ceiling remained. The fractured girder held its impossible bend. And the profound, crushing presence in the far end of the hall did not diminish. It had taken root. It had found its purchase. And I, Arthur Chen, was trapped within its emerging geometry. And crucially, they had left me. A tremor ran through my hand, not of fear, but of an urgent, almost sacred determination. I walked the perimeter of the control room, my footsteps echoing like distant thunder in the cavernous space. The main screens, once vibrant with cosmic data, were dark, but smaller monitors flickered with diagnostic readouts, a testament to the observatory's lingering pulse. This was not defeat, this was an opportunity. They had stripped away the superficial, leaving only the raw nerves of the place, and of my purpose.
The signal.
It was still within me, a phantom hum behind my eyes, a resonant frequency in the marrow of my bones. My sanity, a fragile thing already, was a small price for such ultimate knowledge. My gaze settled on an old, auxiliary data processing unit, tucked away in a dusty corner, connected to a network of sensor arrays that had long been decommissioned. It wasn't designed for interstellar communication, but for local atmospheric monitoring, a relic from an earlier era. Yet, its core processors hummed with an antique resilience.
An idea, half-formed and terrifying, began to coalesce.
If the entity existed beyond conventional dimensions, beyond the reach of our finest instruments, then perhaps the way to touch it was not to reach out, but to open inward. I began to work, my movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. I bypassed safety protocols, ignored the blinking red warnings that flared across the console's minor screens. The remaining power conduits, stripped bare, were rerouted. I fed the raw, unadulterated feedback from the atmospheric sensors, the static of the ionosphere, the faint electromagnetic pulses of the planet itself, directly into the old processing unit. My intention was not to filter, but to amplify, to create a cacophony that might, by sheer overwhelming force, resonate with the internal dissonance the signal had wrought within me. The hum of the observatory intensified, a low, guttural growl rising from the floorboards. Lights flickered in the distant corridors, responding to the strain on the power grid. I pulled up schematics of the defunct sensor network, connecting them in a feedback loop, turning the observatory itself into a vast, crude amplifier of ambient noise. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure. My breath hitched in my throat, a dry rasp. This wasn't about data anymore, it was about resonance. It was about creating a sympathetic vibration, a bridge forged of pure, unadulterated sensory input. I sat before the main console, its screens now displaying a kaleidoscope of raw, unfiltered sensor data, swirling patterns of static, shimmering lines of electromagnetic interference, faint pulses that mimicked a distorted heartbeat. I leaned forward, pressing my forehead against the cool glass of the central monitor. I closed my eyes, letting the vibrations from the console hum against my skull, letting the rising roar of the observatory fill my ears. The world began to melt. The solid lines of the control room rippled, the metallic sheen of the consoles wavered. It was the signal, but no longer a mere pattern of data. It was a presence, a vast, formless awareness pressing in from all sides. I was no longer observing, I was immersed. My mind splintered. Memories flashed, disconnected and surreal, a childhood stargazing, the sterile scent of a laboratory, the face of a colleague, their features now indistinct, melting like wax. These fragments of my life, once anchors, now floated untethered in a boundless ocean of pure sensation. The entity wasn't revealing itself to me, it was revealing itself as me. A silent scream tore through my consciousness. My hands clawed at the console, seeking purchase, seeking reality. But the console itself was liquid, shifting under my touch. My own skin felt porous, permeable, as if the boundary between my flesh and the air around me had dissolved. I was dissolving. The roaring crescendo of the observatory's feedback loop reached its peak, a sustained shriek that tore at the very fabric of my being. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of an ultimate quiet, a stillness so vast it swallowed all noise, all light, all form. Not with my eyes, for my eyes were gone, but with the raw, exposed nerve endings of my mind. It was not a creature, not a being, but the absence of being, a cosmic negation that paradoxically contained everything. It was the unshape, the anti-form, the ultimate truth I had sought. And a faint, almost imperceptible crackle, like static clinging to the edge of silence, caught my attention. My fingers, numb from hours of meticulous rewiring, danced across the exposed circuits, bypassing the disabled main controls. Each click of a salvaged relay, each flicker of a low-power indicator, was a tiny victory against the overwhelming emptiness. I wasn't rebuilding, I was coaxing a dying breath from a mechanical corpse. The intent was not to transmit, not to analyze in the traditional sense, but merely to listen. To open a single, fragile ear to the impossible hum I knew still resonated out there. My eyes, gritty from lack of sleep, scanned the auxiliary display, a salvaged monitor flickering with green text. There, in the rudimentary data stream, was a familiar pattern of non-repeating chaos, a signature I had chased to the precipice of my sanity. It was weaker, distorted by the jury-rigged connection, but undeniably present. It was it. The room, vast and echoing, seemed to shrink, the distant walls pressing in. I leaned closer to the console, my breath fogging the screen, the static now a low roar in my ears. This wasn't merely a signal I was receiving, it was an intrusion, a direct communion. The barrier between data and perception began to dissolve. The first manifestation was a shift in light. Not a change in the observatory's dim illumination, but an internal alteration, as if my optic nerves were suddenly perceiving wavelengths entirely new. Colors bled into existence, shades that defied human categorization, hues that tasted of regret and vastness. They weren't seen by my eyes, but felt by my mind, a cascade of impossible spectrums painting the inside of my skull. Then came the sound. The static, which had built into a roar, now resolved into a symphony of disharmony. It was a chord struck across dimensions, a chorus of cosmic indifference. Each note was a universe, each interval an eon. My ears strained, then rebelled. I clawed at my temples, trying to shut it out, but it was inside me, a resonance in my very atoms. My perception of the radio observatory began to warp. The console beneath my hands seemed to ripple, its solid steel flowing like liquid mercury. The floor tilted, not physically, but within the geometry of my mind. The ceiling stretched upwards into an infinite, starless night, then collapsed inwards into a single, crushing point. I was no longer in a building, I was adrift in a non-Euclidean dreamscape, where space and time were playthings of a colossal, indifferent will. The entity revealed itself not as an image or a voice, but as an overwhelming, uncontainable truth. It was the negative space, the absence that defined existence, yet it was also the absolute fullness, the primordial everything from which all reality was merely a fleeting, patterned ripple. It wasn't alive in any way I understood, it simply was. A consciousness so vast, so ancient, that my own fragile sense of self was a microscopic tremor in its immeasurable awareness. Memories, equations, faces, all the ordered data of my life, were scattered like dust motes in an infinite gale. I saw the universe not as a collection of galaxies, but as a single, trembling membrane on the surface of an unfathomable ocean. And the signal, the intricate, impossible patterns I had dedicated my life to deciphering, was merely the static on that ocean's boundless, indifferent surface. I collapsed to the grimy concrete floor, my body seizing, muscles locking. My lungs burned, unable to draw air in a reality that felt too thin, too vast. My vision blurred, tears streaming from eyes that had seen too much, understood too little, and now understood everything.
The impossible colors still danced behind my eyelids, the cosmic disharmony still echoed in my ruined mind. I lay there, trembling, an insignificant speck of consciousness utterly ruined, yet utterly aware. The truth had not been gentle, it had been an annihilation. And I was what remained. But they had left the peripheral systems humming, a skeletal framework of what once was, and a resonance. Not a sound, precisely, but a deep, vibrating hum that settled in the bone, a constant companion to the fracturing of my sight. It was a lingering breath, an unseen tide pulling at the edges of the visible world. I was a hollow shell, a chrysalis left behind after something else had unfurled. The air itself seemed to ripple with a silent language, the patterns of the signal no longer confined to the screens, but imprinted upon the very particles around me. My eyes, once keen instruments of empirical observation, now perceived not reality, but the terrifying truth behind it. Walls breathed. Distant light fixtures pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm that had no source. The silence was not empty, but thick with unspoken geometries. A scuffing of boots echoed from the main access corridor, a mundane intrusion into my sacred, terrible space. I did not flinch, did not turn, merely registered the approaching presence as another ripple in the fabric. The sound grew louder, accompanied by a low grumble. Then, the maintenance worker emerged, his uniform a splash of practical blue against the muted grays of the facility. He carried a toolkit, its metallic clinking harsh in the profound stillness. "Still here, Arthur?" the maintenance worker asked, his voice rough around the edges, a familiar query that held a new, unsettling quality to my ears. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the stripped consoles, then settled on me. "Different. Like the air's gone thin." I remained silent, watching him. He scratched his chin, a habitual gesture, but the movement seemed to stutter, momentarily out of sync with the flow of time. He walked towards one of the humming peripheral power conduits, a low-voltage unit that had always been a steady, unremarkable drone. As he approached, I saw it. A faint shimmer, like heat haze, radiating not from the conduit itself, but from the air around it. The maintenance worker leaned in, his ear close to the buzzing panel. "Hear that? It's not right. Been getting worse all week." A high-pitched whine underneath the hum. "Makes my teeth ache." He frowned, tapping the panel with a knuckle. "And the lights. They flicker sometimes, even when the power's stable." This was it. The event. The telltale signs. He was experiencing the subtle bleed-through. He pulled a screwdriver from his kit, his movements a little too deliberate, a little too slow. "Think I'll just check the wiring. Might be a loose connection." As he worked, his hands trembled almost imperceptibly, his fingers fumbling with a screw. He was not clumsy, he was disoriented. His perception was starting to fray. "Funny thing," he muttered, not looking at me, his voice taking on a distant, musing quality. "Sometimes, when I look at these panels, the lines, they don't quite meet. Like the metal itself is trying to pull apart, but not really. Just seems that way." The reveal. He was describing the nascent perceptual distortions, the very cracks through which the entity peered. The impossible geometry, the shifting reality that had consumed me, was now beginning to touch him. He was not seeing a loose connection, he was seeing the nascent patterns of the signal,
the non-Euclidean angles manifesting in his vision. My prolonged exposure, my deciphering of the signal, had saturated this place, had imbued it with a residual echo of the entity's presence. And now, anyone who lingered, anyone who listened to the peripheral hum, anyone who merely breathed the air, risked becoming another fractured lens through which the unseen could manifest. The radio observatory, once a sanctuary of scientific endeavor, was now a conduit, an open gate. The maintenance worker grunted, twisting a screw tight. He straightened up, rubbing his temples. Headache's a real corker today. And I could swear that conduit just shifted. Just for a second. And I knew, with a certainty that transcended sanity, that the horror had only just begun to truly spread. The hum of the main server rack in the radio observatory was a familiar drone, a constant companion through countless starless nights. Tonight, it felt different. It was a chord struck in a key I no longer recognized, vibrating not just through the metal floor beneath my worn boots, but through the very marrow of my bones. I stood before the colossal parabolic dish controls, my fingers hovering over the cool, worn buttons. Determination, brittle as old glass, still held me. I had to see it through, to unravel the final, terrible knot of the signal. The air in the control room, usually crisp with the scent of ozone and stale coffee, now carried a faint, coppery tang, like an old wound. Outside the reinforced windows, the night sky was a deeper, more profound black than I had ever known. It wasn't merely the absence of light, it was an active, consuming presence, a vast emptiness that pressed against the glass, eager to seep in. The distant, faint glimmer of city lights seemed to falter, their artificial glow struggling against the encroaching nullity. My terminal screen flickered, displaying the impossible patterns of the anomalous signal. It wasn't just data anymore, it was a heartbeat, slow and immense, echoing the silent thrum I felt in my chest. My eyes, once trained to discern the faintest celestial anomaly, now saw new layers in the static, fractals of a geometry never meant for human perception. Each line, each curve, seemed to writhe, to suggest forms that defied dimension, to whisper secrets that tore at the fabric of my understanding. I pressed a series of commands, my movements precise, mechanical. The massive dish outside groaned, a low, metallic shriek as it adjusted its orientation, swiveling towards the void that had birthed the signal. The sound was amplified, stretched, contorted in my mind, becoming less a mechanical protest and more a primal cry. The vibration intensified, rattling the loose panels in the ceiling, stirring dust motes into a frantic, chaotic dance in the shafts of the emergency lights. The main monitor, a wide, curved screen displaying the process signal, brightened with an unbearable intensity. It wasn't light, it was a revelation, a raw, unfiltered essence pouring directly into my consciousness. The patterns exploded, no longer confined to the two-dimensional display. They bloomed in the air before me, shimmering, iridescent geometries that pulsed with an internal luminescence. My peripheral vision blurred, the familiar contours of the radio observatory dissolving into shifting, impossible angles. The walls seemed to breathe, the floor to undulate, as if the very atoms composing them were rearranging themselves to accommodate this new, boundless reality. A low, resonant tone began to emanate from the speakers, a sound that bypassed my ears entirely, resonating instead directly within my skull. It was the signal, stripped of its mathematical disguise, raw and resonant. It was a chord of creation and dissolution, a sound that brought both agonizing clarity and an overwhelming sense of insignificance. My determination, once a shield, now crumbled into dust. I wasn't just observing it, I was in it. The horror wasn't something external I could analyze, it was the new lens through which I perceived the world. My hands, still resting on the console, felt alien, disconnected. I watched them, detached, as they began to trace patterns on the cool plastic, mimicking the impossible geometries that now swam before my eyes. The coppery tang in the air grew stronger, metallic and sweet, and I realized it was the scent of my own perception tearing. The final revelation wasn't a sudden flash, but a slow, inexorable unfolding. They were not merely a signal from something, they were the something. An entity not of matter or energy, but of pure, incomprehensible pattern. It was the negative space between all things, the silent observer of cosmic indifference, and it had simply decided to be here. Not arriving, not manifesting in a physical sense, but rather, always having been, and now, simply known. I looked out the window again. The city lights were gone, swallowed by the profound night. A subtle, internal luminescence permeated everything, a faint, shifting glow that painted the colossal dishes outside in hues of deep violet and shimmering green. The world had not ended, it had merely been re-rendered, filtered through the impossible logic of the signal. My breath hitched, not in fear, but in a strange, terrible awe. My mind, once a fortress of reason, was now a porous membrane, allowing the endless night to seep in, to become the very substance of my thoughts. The hum of the server rack, the vastness of the dish, the flickering screen, all were now part of a single, interwoven tapestry of impossible existence. I felt the presence not as a distinct entity, but as a fundamental shift in the very quality of being. I closed my eyes, but the patterns persisted, burning behind my eyelids, clearer than ever. When I opened them, the world was still there, familiar yet utterly transformed. The radio observatory was no longer just a building of steel and glass, it was a monument, a silent, echoing testament to a truth too vast for human minds. I stood, unmoving, my senses now attuned to the symphony of the impossible, a living echo of the endless night. The stars, once distant suns, were now merely pinpricks in the boundless canvas of its presence. And I knew, with a terrifying, serene clarity, that humanity, in its frantic search for meaning, had only ever been gazing into a mirror, unknowingly reflecting the terrifying insignificance of its own existence against the backdrop of an awareness that had no beginning, and would have no end.